Our arrival was not as we had envisioned it. So I'm going to tell a little story here. I won't mention any names. But so as we show up at Incirlik, the weather was not good. So we did a radar trail arrival, 2 miles between each of the F-15s. And the runway we were approaching, right at the end of the runway is the boundary fence for the airfield, and outside was civilian world. And just to the right of the runway, I don't remember which one we were on that we were arriving at, there was a factory with a big parking lot, and that factory is where they at least bottled or maybe made Effie's beer. That's like one of the national beers of Turkey. So I just say that in prelude. So as we're in 2 Mile Trail, straight into this runway, one of our airplanes, when he gets near the final approach fix, he's in the soup and has to configure, puts the gear down. One of his AIM-9s fires. There's no target. The master arm, he swears it was not on, and I believe him. We're all very professional pilots. Don't know what happened, but this AIM-9, and he's pointed at the base where we're going to go land. The AIM-9 did not make it to the runway, but it landed just short in the parking lot of the beer factory and blew a big hole in their parking lot. And then the rest, we all come in and land okay, but that was not the way we wanted to arrive.
Muddy, welcome to 10% Truth. Thanks for joining us on the channel.
Hi, Steve.
Muddy, actually, I should say before I launch into an introduction that there are some interviews that I do that take a really, really long time to set up. Not many. Most of them I get to do probably within 3 to 6 months of being introduced to somebody. But you're one of the slipperier fish, or the trickier catches, if you will. So first thing I should say is thank you to Starbaby, because Starbaby introduced us to one another.
Absolutely.
But I think it's taken a year and a half or so, maybe longer, of communicating with you, because you have an interesting day job, which maybe you'll talk to us about later. Maybe you won't. But it does mean you're gone a fair amount of time. So I wanted to just say to you how grateful I am for the opportunity to talk to you and to the audience at home. I've written a lot about the F-15. I've interviewed quite a few of the MiG killers, and Muddy is one of the few MiG killers that I never had a chance to speak to and never had a chance to interview. And I know, Muddy, that your kill is fairly well written about in Quizmo Brown's book, Debrief, but I don't think it's that well documented elsewhere. And I've never seen an interview with you, a taped interview with you. So I think what we're going to have is something fairly special, and it definitely fulfills the criteria of this channel being an oral history of air combat and the stories of aviators who prepared for air combat, maybe even if they didn't actually go to combat in the end. So thank you for joining us. Right.
Well, I'm happy to join you. I had not given interviews. I talked to a few people after coming home, but then it was just right back to business. So no, there aren't any other interviews.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, this is a treat then. So for the audience at home, then we're going to do this in 2 parts. So we're going to talk to Muddy about his career in the Air Force as a young fighter pilot, what it was like getting to the F-15, what his aspirations were as a child, and what his route to the cockpit was like. And then we'll talk about his experience as a young guy assigned to the 32nd Tactical Fighter Wing at Soesterberg in the Netherlands, from where he then deployed to combat in Desert Storm. And his kill was on the 28th of January, 1991. There are 10 or so days of combat before that kill occurred. And what we're going to do from an interview point of view is we're going to get to the point where he gets to day 10, and then we're going to cut off. And part 2, we will start with him recounting the story of his kill in Desert Storm. So that's what we're going to do. Oh, and of course, if you're listening to this at home, like, share, subscribe to the channel. Please make sure that this story reaches as many people as possible. And if you want to support the channel, go to 10percenttrue.com, buy a polo shirt, buy a book. All those things help. Appreciate it. All right, Muddy, that's my talking done. I don't expect to do much more for the next hour or so. Can you give us a quick introduction, then tell us who you are, maybe give us a précis of your Air Force career, and then we'll go right back to the beginning and understand what it was that drove you to become a fighter pilot.
I was born into an Air Force family. My father was active duty at the time. He was not a pilot, but that just meant I spent my formative years, bouncing around from one Air Force base to the next. So airplanes were always around somewhere. And I decided very early on, without ever having been in an airplane, that I wanted to be a pilot. I was in an airport one time with my parents picking up my grandparents, and I saw this big old jet pull up towards the big windows. And then I told my parents then and there, I'm going to fly someday. And then I was just pretty much focused on that. Was it the right decision? I'm glad I did it, and I'm still doing it today.
Why the Air Force then?
I think it was probably because I was most familiar with the Air Force. That's the way I grew up. As we moved around, it was always to Air Force bases. They had the best airplanes. They had the most airplanes. That's what I was familiar with, and I wanted to be at the top of the game right from the get-go. So I went that way. I did apply in high school to both the Air Force and the Naval Academies, and I got offered an appointment at both of them, and I ended up turning them both down. So I considered the Navy as well, but ended up in the Air Force. I've done one exchange tour with the Navy, and I really enjoyed that. But I think overall, I picked the right service.
Well, why did you turn down the offers for the academies then?
I was, a young kid. I had discovered girls, and going to the academy, that was not going to be part of the equation. So instead, I went to a civilian university, and I didn't have those kinds of restrictions.
Did you do ROTC then?
I did. I had a ROTC scholarship,
and
a pilot slot at the time.
Okay. What sort of dates would this have been?
I went to college from 78 to 82. That was my basic, 4-year undergraduate degree. And then again, due to girls, instead of going to pilot training in 1982, and I had orders to go start my Air Force flying career, I needed another year because the girl I was hanging out with at the time was a year behind me. So they said, we can only delay you if you're still a full-time student. So I went to grad school for another year, and then I went off and actually started my Air Force career in 83.
Okay. As part of ROTC, did you do any flying? I mean, am I right in thinking that you fly Cessna 152s, that kind of thing, light aircraft type thing?
Yeah, back in those days, my scholarship was based on being a pilot. So they paid for the first 3 years of my college. And then in the summer, between my third and fourth year, they make you go to a civilian flight school and get your civilian pilot's license. Today, they don't do that anymore. They get you through solo. But back then, they gave you 40 hours of a flying training budget, and you had to come out with a license at the end of it, or you were considered, not going to be a military pilot. So I went to a flight school in Schenectady, New York, and within the 40 hours, I became a civilian pilot and flying a Cessna 152.
So the question I was going to ask, the curiosity I had was, so you, as a child, you look at these airplanes and say, I'm going to do that one day. When you actually start flying, how do you find it? And by that, I mean, does it fit with the expectations that you had in terms of the visceral experience of flying, the feeling, the hand-eye coordination piece, or all of whatever expectations you had as somebody who's on the ground looking up? When you were up there looking down, did it work for you? Did you find it easy? Was it something that you found enjoyable?
I certainly found it enjoyable. From day one, I kind of describe being in an airplane as my happy place. I think I'm a little bit non-standard in the flying world, that I'm just happy being up there. I've flown lots of airplanes, helicopters, balloons, gliders, seaplanes, jets, props, and I like them all. I don't look down on any of them, and I really enjoyed it. I looked at the the 152, I knew that wasn't where I was going to stay. It's an airplane. It gets you in the air and gets to look, down on the rest of the planet, and I enjoy that. But I also knew that was just a stepping stone. By that time, I had, refined my goals. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I knew that was just, one of the bigger first steps to get there. It was also, though, the first time I was ever in an airplane. I was one of 6 kids. When we took family vacations, it was not in an airplane. So I had never been in the air before, and I got to start flying, and I loved it. I still do.
Tell me about the refinement then of your ambition to becoming a fighter pilot. What drove that, and what things had you seen that made you want to do that?
It was just the challenge. I challenge myself all the time. I want to be the best at what I'm doing, and I want to work in the best environment. And as I looked across the options, I decided I wanted to be a military pilot. I think that was due to my upbringing. I liked the moving around. I liked seeing the world. I liked traveling. And then as I looked in the opportunities that were out there, and I primarily focused on the Air Force and the Navy, and I saw a rotary wing, and I saw at the time what they called TTB, Tanker Transport Bomber, and then I saw FAR, Fighter Attack and Reconnaissance. And looking at those 3 categories of aircraft, the pinnacle from my perspective was Fighter Attack Reconnaissance, and amongst those 3, fighters were at the top of the heap. And in the fighter world at the time I was going through, the F-15 was at the pinnacle. So that's where I set my sights. I wanted to go fly the F-15.
How did your progress through UPT go then? I'm assuming it was called UPT, or was it SUPT? I don't know.
It was not SUPT. They didn't have it at the time. Okay. So it was just UPT. I went to Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas, because I had taken a year delay. I was going in with most of my classmates were, a year younger than me, not necessarily age-wise, although I think that applied, but they had just come out of college and were going to pilot training, what I should have done in 82. So I was, even though I was a second lieutenant, I was one of the senior guys in my class. I was the second most senior, which I liked because the senior guy had to be the class leader. So he got all the responsibility of keeping the rest of us together, and I just got to go have fun. But I thoroughly enjoyed it all.
You would have flown T-37B? Would that have been when you first flew?
Correct. You start out, UPT at the time, the first couple of months were purely academics, and then you had... it was 4 or 5 months in the T-37, and then everybody at that time went to the T-38. Today, they divide the class, and you either go to T-38 for the fighter guys or something else for the guys that are going to go into other roles. So we all went to the T-38 at the time.
Yeah, is it T1? Is that what they send them to?
Yes, the T1.
T1, yeah. So, and where were you in your rankings at this point? And so, before you got to T38, were you demonstrating any particular aptitude? I mean, it sounds like you were nonplussed in the Cessna. You appreciated that it was the stepping stone, but you didn't mention having any troubles or any difficulties or any issues to overcome. Did that hold true for the T-37?
It did. Flying seems to have come easy for me, but I also put an awful lot of work into it, when I'm not at work. I spent a lot of time studying and chair flying and knowing my stuff, but I did well enough in the T-37 that when I went to the T-38, I was in the FAR track. Again, that was my goal. And then when I finished in T-38s, I was not the number one in my class, but I think I was the number 2 guy in my class.
How big was the class?
We started with, I think, like 30, maybe 35 pilots, and we graduated maybe 18.
Really? Okay.
There was a big washout rate.
You never had any, I mean, did you hook any rides? Did you fail any rides? Did you ever have it at any point? Because what I hear about people going through that, particularly the people who are at the top of the class, is that they go through and something will happen. They'll have a ride that they hook or they fail, and then there'll be a crisis of confidence because they will have thought they were doing well, and now suddenly they're not doing well. And as I understand it, you don't have many opportunities to redo rides. You know, you might get it twice, and then maybe you're on a what the RAF call a chop ride, or, you know, which is where you're going to get cut from the program completely. Did that happen to you?
No, I was fortunate, I guess. I never hooked a ride. They graded them, as I recall, you could get an excellent, a good, a fair, or a bust, an unset. That's where the hook comes from. It's a big old U. And I didn't get any U's. So I didn't go to any what you referred to as chop rides. When I was at UPT, if you hooked a ride, you know, you could just redo it. If you hooked it again, then they gave you what was called an 87 ride, which is practice because you're below standard. And they might give you 1, 2, or 3, depending on how you're doing and, you know, what phase of training you're in, how much they've invested in you. And then after the 87, you'd go fly an 88 ride, which was with one of the supervisors in the squadron. And if you pass the 88, you're right back into the training pipeline. If you hooked the 88, you'd get another 1 or 2 or 3 87 rides. And then you'd fly what they called an 89. And if you hooked the 89 ride, you're done. You know, you were washed out of pilot training. And it happened all the time. We lost a pretty big percentage of our class. And I was just one of multiple classes that are there over the course of the year. So it was not at all uncommon.
When did you find out then that you were going to get the F-15? When did your assignment night take place?
It was towards the end of training. I guess that makes sense. As I recall, I graduated in May of 84. So I think our drop night was probably April, late April. The first guy, and at the time, you got to pick based on your ranking in the class. And our class drop didn't have any F-15s. There was one F-16, and the number 1 guy got that. And then when it was my turn, I could have picked an F-4. That was all that was. I think there's an F-4 and an RF-4. Or you could be FAIP'd, first assignment IP, and I was FAIP'd. So I stayed there in Del Rio flying the T-38 for the next 3.5 years. At the time, I was disappointed, but looking back, boy, what a great experience that was. And I really think that is what set me up to do as well as I did after the fact. Because you flew an awful lot as a instructor at UPT. We were limited, as I recall, to no more than 75 hours in a rolling 30-day period. It's not a calendar month, but, you know, count back 30 days and you can only fly 75 hours. And I spent most of my time as an instructor having to track that closely. And unfortunately, you know, being grounded for a day or two because I was going to go over my 75 hours. So they'd send me to teach in the simulator instead until enough time dropped off that I could go fly again. You know, and the sorties were generally a 1.3. So I was flying a lot for 3.5 years running.
Can you describe then a little bit about how that set you up then? So the logical part of me thinks, well, presumably you're in the back seat. The student's doing a lot of flying. It's very repetitive. There's a finite number of things that you're doing. You know, I don't know, takeoffs, go arounds,
Hundreds.
navigation, all that kind of stuff. So how did that set you up then to be successful later in your career?
A couple of things come to mind immediately. To begin with, to be an instructor, to be a good instructor, and I, like I've said before, I want to be the best at whatever it is I'm doing. You really have to know your stuff. So I knew all about the airplane. I knew all about the regulations. I know about the rules for flying in the military and the civilian airspace. And I had to be able to teach that to my students. And you needed to be able to understand what it took to make the airplane do what you wanted to do, and then demonstrate it to somebody, and then watch them. And when it didn't turn out right, you had to know why. What did they do wrong at what point in the maneuver such that it didn't work? And I think the T-38 was a great airplane for that. It's the fastest landing airplane that I've ever flown. It was landing faster than anything else in inventory at the time. So things happen quick, and the students and the instructors, you got to be on your feet. And it really made me a good pilot, both stick and rudder wise, and technically in the books. And that it helped me ever since. Helps me to this day.
Did you ever, in that 3.5 years or so, then did you have moments where you were scared because the student did something and it caught you off guard, or?
I think anybody who's been teaching for a while, you get that no matter what the airplane is. But the one that scared me the most, and I can remember it like it was yesterday, in the T-38, sort of a standard maneuver would be a single engine go around, a heavyweight single engine go around. Heavyweight being relative, T-38 is not a very heavy airplane, but it's not got real powerful engines either. So we would take off fully fueled. This was in Texas, West Texas, in the desert. So in the summertime, it's pretty hot out there. So we take off as heavy as the airplane can be, get right into the radar pattern, come around, shoot an instrument approach down to less than 100 feet, and then tell the student to go around and to go. It's only got one engine. It's simulated one engine. So we'd have one back to idle. So now we're a heavy airplane, hot temperature. I think the field elevation out there is 2,000-ish feet. And you have one engine, put it into afterburner, and it is struggling to stop that descent and get up and away. And you got to step on the rudder. And all UPT bases are 3 parallel runways. And these heavyweight go-rounds are always done in the middle one, because the T-37s run one, the T-38s run the other, and the straight ends would come into the middle. And I had a student, I had been there a while. I was a senior instructor, and I was flying 87 rides. We talked about that before, for a student pilot who was having difficulty. And his problem at the time just consistently wasn't coordinating the rudder with the afterburner. Like the afterburner on one engine, even though it's pretty close together, it takes some rudder, and you're in a thrust critical scenario. So you've got to line everything up to get the best performance out of the airplane. And I had an 87 ride with him before, and he had the same problem then. That's what he busted his ride for, why he came to me. So I made a really big point in our pre-brief: use the rudder, use the rudder, use the rudder. So we came in, we are less than 100 feet. I tell him to go around. He lights the single afterburner, and then he put in full rudder. And we were almost inverted, maybe 100 and, I don't know, it felt like inverted. The guys, my friends that were in the box, CRTU, they said I was probably 120 degrees of bank. I'm going downhill, and I got one engine, and the chevrons are going by my canopy up here. Scared the crap out of me. I took the airplane, we recovered. We were low enough. I lit both afterburners, obviously, but I dusted off the overrun as I turned around, and I don't know, I was lucky enough to live through it. Scared the hell out of me. But I remember that like it was yesterday. Now, that's the most scared I've been in an airplane.
Did that student get through the course in the end?
He did not.
Wow.
But that's pilot training. Those kind of things just really get your attention.
Wow. Did you do any? So one of the things that you find when you talk to, especially like the Germans or whatever, who went to Holloman and did their training and then came back to Europe, and the Brits who go out and do Shepherd and JPT now, that kind of stuff, they come back. One of the things that's observed often is that it's crystal clear, gin clear skies, great VFR flying weather. Did you ever do any deployments going in search of weather or anything like that? Were you guys aware of the fact that you would end up sending some pilots to Europe where the weather was crap, and that therefore, getting them used to some kind of IMC flying would be advisable?
We were aware of that. There just isn't a whole lot of bad weather out there in West Texas. That's why they put pilot training bases away from populations and where the weather is good. But we would have bad weather. But I have been referred to more than once by myself and others as a flying whore. I just want to go fly. So I spent a lot of time as a FAIP at the ops desk on those relatively rare bad weather days where it's low ceilings or fog, poor visibility. We don't know what the areas are like, and they would designate a weather ship. And on those bad weather days, I would just hang around the ops desk and, volunteer persistently. I'll go be your weather ship. I'll be your weather ship. I'll be your weather ship, to take off and go up into the goo to figure out the ceiling, the layers, and what the areas look like. You're the only guy flying. The weather can be poor. T-38 didn't like the ice, so we had to pay more attention to that. But I've flown approaches to minimums. In the T-38 for training, we know folks are going to Europe. They'd sit in the back seat for their instrument rides, and we put a curtain that covers a complete canopy, so they can't see anything outside. And on those rides, the instructor is up front, so even on a clear day, they are completely enclosed. They can't see outside at all. So we do, at the time, I'm sure they still do, really push that. And then the simulators, obviously, you can make the weather whatever it is you want. So there was a fair amount of that.
So just as a bit of a nerdy question, but if you were in the back seat and you had the curtain, were you expected to take off like that, or so maintain a heading on the HSI or something during the takeoff roll and then take off from it, or did you give control to the guy in the back once you'd already sucked the gear up and were airborne?
I recall the guy in the front would do the takeoff, and the guy in the back would then pull the curtain. But there were times when maybe you did things differently. You could do an instrument takeoff. You had to grade this thing called an ITO, an instrument takeoff. So the guy in the back, I think he was supposed to have the curtain open, but we didn't always do that. And you're paying very close attention to your heading indicator. You get it lined up on the runway without the curtain, and then you don't let your heading vary by a degree, one or the other, as you're rolling down the runway. So it could be done. It wasn't done very often. But in the pilot training world, I guess maybe where I did most of that was in what they call PIT, pilot instructor training. Once you were FAIP'd, you'd go to Randolph Air Force Base to pilot instructor training. That was a 3-month period of time. You just graduated, so you're a brand new pilot. You spend 3 months at PIT learning how to be an instructor pilot, and then you'd go start teaching students. So it may be at PIT that I'm remembering doing, no kidding, takeoffs from the back with the curtain drawn. But I thought PIT did a great job, turning young guys like myself. And I can say guys without getting too many people upset, because at that time, there weren't any women. Other things we did in PIT that I've never done since, we would do formation touch and goes in the T-38. You're 3 feet off the wing and you come in and both airplanes are doing a touch and go, and you're the wingman. You don't know where you're going to touch because you're on the wing. And Nobody else does that. I don't even think they do it at Pitt anymore. But that's the kind of things that we did to make sure instructors were going to be good instructors.
Yeah, I think now there's I think it's generally accepted, but I think there are some crusty old salts who don't like it. But they took away formation landing now, didn't they? So they
Really?
Yeah, because they had I think they had a fatal mishap on a formation landing. I think the aircraft flipped. One of the aircraft flipped. Two guys in the airplane died, and I think that was the death knell for that particular thing in the Air Force. And I think the Air Force just said, look, there's just no reason to do it anymore. Single ship landings, with 20-second spacing or whatever the standard spacing is, that's okay. Yeah. We can get away with that. We don't need two airplanes landing on the runway at the same time. So that's gone, I think. So, and of course,
so when I was there, it was touch and go with information.
That's crazy. Tell me a little bit more, Muddy, about the emotional aspect of not getting that F-15 out of your drop night then. So you said it was disappointing. You've already explained that you are somebody who wants to conquer the role, to be the best that he can be. So you applied yourself to it. So I think it's clear you took that decision or that outcome well, in the sense that you just got on with it and you made the best of it. But 3.5 years is a long time to wait, not knowing whether or not you're going to get an F-15 at the end of that. Does that sort of niggle at you at all? Does it eat away at your psyche a little bit?
I really don't think so. It did at first. I was disappointed. It wasn't the path that I had envisioned for myself. But I started thinking about that beforehand, because before drop night, what the mix of airplanes are going to be. And I knew there weren't any F-15s in there. So I was beginning to think about it from then. And then after the fact, I flew so very much, and I just loved it. I told you the 75 hours every 30 days. When we were between classes, because whatever flight you were in, there'd be a couple weeks, maybe in the beginning and maybe end of a class, when you're not flying much because they're doing academics or other stuff. I'd go fly with other flights. I looked back at my logbooks, and over those 3.5 years, I went cross-country mostly with students, but I went cross-country in the T-38 on average every third weekend for 3.5 years. And I was married at the time. That might not have been the best decision, but I just enjoyed it that much. And I kept, a map. I like to fly, and I like to go to different places. So I wouldn't go back to the same place over and over again. I went to a different set of airports every time that I went. And I was kept a map filling in all the little runways I'd been to. I got down to Florida and up to Maine and up in Washington and down in Southern California and everywhere in between. It was just fantastic. I loved it. So I don't know, I adapted well to that, and I enjoyed it a lot.
When did you find out you were going to get an F-15 then?
It wasn't until, my next set of orders. I had done well as an instructor pilot. So I think the system kind of worked to get me an F-15. So it came time to get the orders. I don't remember the details, but I knew I was going to go on an F-15. But first you start out going to what was then called Lead-In Fighter Training Lift at Holloman Air Force Base. And that's where you go learn to fly the T-38 better. And again, that was a course made for students just graduating from UPT. They know how to fly the T-38, but they might have, 175 hours in it. I went to lift with 1,500 hours in the T-38. And to me, that was a vacation. I loved it. I flew the airplane pretty well by then. I knew it better than the instructors. They had to teach me the fighter tactics and techniques that they teach, and that was all new to me. But all the rest of the stuff, the academics and the basic flying, that was just a vacation. So I really enjoyed lift. And then it was to RTU. And when I got to RTU, my initial set of F-15 orders, I don't remember, but I think I was going to Langley. And when we got there, one of the guys in my RTU class had orders going to Soesterberg. And he didn't want to leave the United States. So he and I worked a deal to trade, and then we had to convince the personnel center that it was good for them too. So we did. And then I swapped orders with him. He went to Langley, and I got to go to Soesterberg.
Before we talk about the Netherlands then and your first assignment, tell us about the FTU. Tell us about getting to, where did you go? Triple Nickel? Was it?
I went to Tyndall Air Force Base in the 2nd fighter training. I think they're called the Horny Horses.
Okay.
But the number was the 2nd. And I was there at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida.
Can you describe what it was like walking up to the F-15 for the first time, then knowing you were going to go and fly it?
It was huge. Coming from the T-38, going to the F-15, that was just a big airplane. And I was just in awe of it. It's the best airplane flying at the time anywhere in the planet. It's got a greater than 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio. And I got to fly that thing. I was a little apprehensive because at RTU, you solo that thing on your 5th ride. And that just seemed a short amount of time for a guy who had not flown it yet. But everybody does. It's a very easy airplane to fly. It's challenging to employ it, but it's very easy to fly. But I didn't know that first time, and I was a little apprehensive. But I dove into it with both feet and did pretty well.
Your first ride in it, is it from the back seat?
No, your first ride, you're up front.
Okay. Do you do the takeoff? You do the whole thing?
Yep. You have simulators first. Just like in UPT, you start out with just academics, and then you have several simulators, and then you go fly. But the first flight, you're up front.
You mentioned that thrust to weight ratio of greater than 1-to-1. So coming from the T-38, 1,500 hours, used to certain throttle responses, used to a pace at which things happen, acceleration, so on and so forth. Did it take some adjustment, or how much adjustment maybe is the question, did it take to, because 1,500 hours, I'm sure after 1,500 hours doing anything, you'd feel very comfortable, you'd feel like you'd mastered it. So did it come as a bit of a shock then to fly with that much more performance?
Not really. In some cases, or the biggest difference, the acceleration on takeoff, in the T-38, you light the afterburners, and it's one little mini explosion behind you. You feel them light, and off you go. And that's a kick in the pants. In the F-15, the afterburner is staged, so you get 5 of those every takeoff roll. It's 5 stages that open, and you feel them all. The rate of acceleration is greater. The climb rate can be greater. If you're doing an unrestricted climb, it's a whole lot greater. But other than that, when you cruise around, with nothing else to do, the reason in the T-38 we flew at 300 knots, in the F-15 we flew at 350 knots. That really is, a negligible difference. So the pace of things happening was not a significant difference. It lands slower than the T-38, so you actually have more time on final to make changes. But where it really is different is when you're maneuvering the airplane. The T-38, it bleeds off G relatively quickly. The F-15 can sustain those Gs for a long time. And that's where I noticed the biggest difference. You really couldn't wear yourself out physically in the T-38 if you stay within the G limits, obviously, because the airplane just doesn't have the energy to do it. But in the F-15, you could pull 7 or 8 Gs for 5, 6, 7 minutes. And that can wear you out. So that was the biggest change to me. And then you're always fighting it. There was very little in the F-15 where you're not fighting the airplane. The T-38, the only time there was another airplane around was in the formation phase, and it was always cooperative. Your wingman was always right where he was supposed to be or where you told him to go, and maneuvers were all predictable, and you knew where to look to find him. Well, when you're fighting the F-15, your wingman is the bad guy, and he's never where you expect him to be, and you have to find him while you're maneuvering the airplane, and that was a big difference. But all of it's a lot of fun.
Can you talk a bit about sensors, about the fact that you're running a radar, you're now talking about threat systems, you're talking about the capabilities of other aircraft in comparison to yourself. You have this whole 3D chess analogy people talk about when they describe air combat maneuvering and maneuvering in relation to the enemy. How did that bit sit with you? I'm looking for somewhere where you're struggling. I'm looking to find whether or not there was a point at which you thought, okay, I've met my match. This is tricky. This is difficult.
That was easy, but it took a lot of study and a lot of practice, and I was used to doing that. The airplane itself, the F-15, I give McDonnell Douglas, all the credit because they designed, the best airplane in the world. Nothing else flies that well, and I've flown a lot. We can talk about that later. But the difficulty of the F-15 is employing it. It was the first airplane that made big use with HOTAS, hands-on throttle and stick. And I forgot how many buttons there are between the two throttles and the stick, something in the neighborhood of 12 or 15 buttons. And those buttons aren't just click it on or off. A couple of them are like a trim switch, so it has an up and down, a left or right, and in and out. And that's just one of 12 or 14 switches. Some of them are slides, some of them push buttons. Some of them it changes based on how long you hold it. If it's a press and release or a press and hold a little bit or a press and hold a long time. And that is what makes employing the F-15 a challenge. And I had to work on that just like everybody else did. You got to do the right combination at the right time while you're flying the airplane and you're pulling 8 Gs and trying to look between your tails. And that's the really challenging part of it, is to do it well. You got to learn to play that piccolo while you're flying the airplane.
So you're going to go to Soesterberg, you're going to go to the Netherlands.
Yes.
And that's going to be your first operational assignment. I'm curious to understand the psychological element of feeling like you've almost achieved what you set out to achieve. So all those years before you'd said, okay, I want to be a pilot, and then you refined it and said, I want to be a fighter pilot. Now you are flying the world's greatest air superiority fighter, and you've graduated the B course. You're going to go to the Netherlands for your first operational assignment. Is there a temptation to get ahead of yourself and think I made it? I mean, one of the things that people always say in your line of work is that you're always being tested. So even when you get to the operational squadron, then you've got to become mission qualified. Then you have to become combat ready. And then, then you have to become a 2-ship flight lead. Then you have to become a 4-ship flight lead. So you're always on a pathway. You're always being assessed against some criteria. You're always expected to do more than you could do today. Tomorrow you're expected to do more than you could do today. Is there any part of your mind, though, as you go through that journey and you're about to leave for the Netherlands, where you think I've made it?
Never once think I had that feeling, because I always wanted, to do the next thing, to be the best. And I knew when I got there, I now have wings. I am a F-15 pilot, but I'm not an MR, mission ready F-15 pilot. I had to go through MQT, mission qualification training. So I wanted to do that well. And then once, I come out of that, I'm well aware of the fact that just like at PIT or LIFT or even my UPT, I'm starting that a year or 2 or 3 later than my peers. So I don't know, I feel I have to be better just because I'm more senior. I'm older, but not in a chronological way. So I got to do better. And once I'm a wingman, I got through MQT, now I got to be a 2-ship flight lead. And when like you were saying, then I got to be a 4-ship flight lead. Then I got to be an instructor. Then I got to be a mission commander. And so you're always working to do better. And I always felt that I had to do it quicker than I would have if I had started off. If I graduated from college and went right to pilot training, I'd have been equal with my peers, and we'd all been learning at the same time. But I was a year later to them. So I expected myself to be able to show that. And then when I get to RTU, I'm there with guys that just graduated from pilot training, but I've been Air Force pilot for now 4 years. I ought to be better than that person because I've been here longer. So I just always worked harder to try and, live up to my own expectations of myself. Or if I were them, what are they thinking about me? I've been around here longer than you have. I ought to be better. So I just tried to make that happen.
Is there a similar thing then with regards to turning up at an operational unit, and maybe one of your instructors at the operational unit is somebody who you graduated from UPT 4 years before? So one of your very first students. Did that ever happen to you, or did that happen to you?
It did not. And I think I'm glad it did not.
Yeah.
That would be, I don't know, maybe a little awkward, but something that I really enjoyed about the fighter community is once you got into the briefing room, we always brief 2 hours before you go fly. And once you got into that room and you close the door, your rank, your age, what you've done before, none of that mattered. You would have lieutenants and captains talking to lieutenant colonels and majors and sometimes colonels, the same way. You are there. This is your role. This is what you have to do. And this is what you screwed up. I haven't flown a perfect sortie yet, ever. And in the Eagle community, especially, that it's expected that everybody is going to point out the mistakes that everybody else made so we can all get better at it. I had a little bit of experience that teaching at UPT, pointing out mistakes, but it was different there because there you're just trying to earn your wings. You get into the fighter community and you screwed that up, you or I may not be coming home that night. So it took on a whole new realm, and rank just didn't matter. So yeah, that was another good place to learn. I loved it.
Well, Muddy, tell us a bit more about that culture then. The F-15 community does have a reputation, I think, as with anything. I mean, the aeroplane's been in service for decades. And so over that period of time, over that continuum of time, there have been good things and not so good things, let's say. But the Eagle community generally has a reputation for being sort of very strict in the sense that, they don't let anything pass. If you didn't do something right, you get called on it. Everything has to be perfect. Absurdly lengthy debriefs. I mean, you just talked about 2 hours. I've heard about 5 hours. I mean, guys who've done exchange tours with the Eagle units have said to me, it's just ridiculous the amount of time they spend on it. We'd be done after 2 hours, but they're doing it. So can you talk a little bit about what the culture was like for you then as a FAIP who's coming into that world with sort of 5 or 6 years or so of flying experience, and then what sort of characteristics you saw then in the community from a cultural point of view at that time?
Some of the best pilots I've flown with, have been fellow Eagle drivers, and I don't want to disparage the community. It's a great community. But they had a reputation then. I've been out of the game here. We're talking about decades. We're going back 35 years, when I was at the top of my game. And the airplane, the F-15, was top of the hill back then. But the community had a reputation for eating their own young, what you were talking about. You better do it right. You better do it all right. And you better do it right now. And you got to have a thick skin in the debrief. And because they did that, they made really good fighter pilots, and they had a great reputation. But a lot of people really thought they were kind of assholes because they were that confident. So I felt I had to prove myself coming in as a FAIP'd. Now my peers, rank-wise, time and service-wise, flying hour-wise, they were the four-ship flight leads, and I'm a wingman. And, that wasn't the best place to be. So I had to prove myself with them all the time. I came in kind of with a tick mark against me, but it was all for the betterment of the squadron. And because I was on the outside looking in for those first 4 years, I knew about this reputation, and I tried not to encourage that or promulgate that reputation, but just do a really good job. And I learned that, they did that for a reason, and it showed itself in Desert Storm. Of all the kills that are over there, I think 35 or 36 out of the 41 all were in F-15s. There's a reason for that. So it has its good and its bad, but my God, it's a great airplane, and the guys that, employ it well are great pilots.
Tell us a bit then about your flying at Soesterberg. What's the mission? So the Wolfhounds is just, as if I'm remembering correctly, it's a single squadron, isn't it? So it's the 32nd TAC Fighter Squadron, which is part of the 32nd TAC Fighter Wing. Is that correct?
TAC Fighter Group.
TAC Fighter Group, okay.
Yeah, there was not a 32nd Wing, and that really played into us, or I guess against us, when it was time for the war to start off. We were very unique in that we were a one-squadron group. Our cohorts over in Europe were out of Bitburg. That was the 36th Wing and the 36th Group, and they had 3 squadrons, and we just had the 1. So I think it made our group, our squadron, much tighter because there were so many fewer of us over there doing this business. But we still, acted, I guess, in USAFE as, another fighter wing. When people talked about the fighters that were in Europe, there was the F-15s were Soesterberg and Bitburg. And we were always treated the same, talked about the same, had the same responsibilities, but we were 1/3 the size. That really reared its ugly head when Desert Shield kicked off. But being there, I'm glad I was at Soesterberg. That was the best assignment of my entire career. It was the airplane, it was the people, it was the location, it was the Dutch community. I mean, the Dutch loved having us there. We loved being there. Everything about it, except maybe the winter weather, was really good.
Well, so your mission is going to be, so you're there to defend against East German Air Force or the Soviets coming west. Was there anything specifically you were doing that was unique to being based in the Netherlands? Did you just have a more northern responsibility geographically?
It was pretty much just the geographical separation. We were responsible for the northern portion of the inner German border, although we would go all the way to the southern extremes, and the Bitburg guys would come up north. But we were responsible for that. Berlin Wall was still standing. East Germany and West Germany were still foes, and we were there to stop the hordes, the Russians and the East Germans, from coming west. We had an alert commitment. We always had a 2-ship, fully armed, on alert. That was part of our job. We sat 24-hour alert duty on a rotational basis. That took at least 4 airplanes out of our 1 squadron. Again, it's different because we were smaller. We had the 2 that were on alert, and there were always 2 hot spares. And there frequently was, a fifth airplane that was maybe a cold spare ready for alert, because alert was the primary mission, hot mission that we had then. That's the only hot missions we did. We trained for the big war and we sat alert. I was there. Go ahead.
No. You continue. I'll ask when you finished.
I was there when that inner German border dissolved, the wall came down. So it was neat to be there when that part of history was happening. I was there when I think it was a MiG 23 took off from East Germany and went west, and somebody jumped out, and it was an unmanned airplane, but we didn't know that. And we were having a squadron picnic on the flight line when our 2 alert birds launched. They never launch on a holiday, but they did, and it turned out to be that one.
Yeah.
So, there were those kinds of things. I was on alert once. We got scrambled. The weather was walks off. I mean, it was 0-0. We're not going to launch. So you're a lot more relaxed and laid back, and the horn goes off. The 2 of us looked at each other like, what the hell? But the clock is now running. And I was the wingman. I can remember watching him light the afterburners and disappear. F-15 afterburners are pretty bright. And I am right behind him. And he just disappears into the goo. I wait my 20 seconds and I go, and you can only see 2 runway stripes. Talk about an instrument takeoff and pilot training. I'm glad we did some of that, because I could see 2 stripes on the runway. That's it. And we took off fully armed. You don't go through EOR. They don't arm you like they did during the war. We are armed in the hangar, ready to go. No pins need to be pulled. So we took off. We went and did our mission, and then it was time to come back to Soesterberg. There was no way we were coming home because the weather hadn't changed. It was Europe in the wintertime. So it took the folks on the ground. It was a challenge for them to find somewhere for us to go land. We ended up landing in Germany, but we landed with 2 fully armed, hot F-15s and no pins to safe it. That was a problem for the Germans. But it turned out to be another great story. We're the only 2 guys that sat alert from Soesterberg that got to go cross country. We land, and all we have is the flight suit that we're wearing. The German wing commander picked us up. We spent the night in his house drinking his bourbon. And, we got home a day or 2 later. They had to scramble people back home to go replace us because we're not sitting alert anymore. They parked our airplanes, sort of pointed into the forest, and we probably ran for 45 minutes as they were figuring out, what do we do with these guys? Because our missiles are hot. Our gun is hot. It was a good weekend for us, but not for the guys that had to go scramble to replace us, or for the Germans that had to figure out what to do with us. But it was good.
Is that what they did in the end? Then they just left the airplanes pointed into the forest? Yep. Wow.
Yep.
Wow. Did you actually, while you were when you were doing this, did you intercept anything?
I never intercepted any bad guys. The only bad guys that ever got intercepted were that one that was unmanned at the time. I did get to intercept a lot of airplanes, not generally on alert. On alert, we would go find an occasional airplane that strayed into Dutch or West German airspace. But most of the intercepts, the practice, the getting good with the piccolo to make you better going to combat, anytime we found ourselves airborne at Soesterberg with only 1 airplane, either because the other guy bingoed out, or he had a maintenance problem, or maybe he broke on the ground. So we would just launch as a single ship. We would contact the Dutch controllers, great relationship with the Dutch, and request PIs, practice intercepts. And in the Netherlands, all of the airspace, unlike the US, has dual controllers. There are civilian controllers that control it all, and there are military controllers who control it all. So we would check in with Dutch Mill, request PIs, and we were legally allowed to intercept any airplane. The controllers got great training out of it because they had to find a target, snap us to the target. The targets weren't ever told we were coming. And then we had to intercept that airplane. And, I can remember intercepting airliners at 35,000 feet, and we'd have to get up there and identify them, read a tail number. Okay, fine, nobody really cares. And then your next target is going to be a Cessna at 1,500 feet. So you dive down there and you change all your tactics because you're going to have a slow mover, and then it could be a business jet, and then it's back to another airliner, and then maybe it's a fighter on his way home to Bitburg or Han, and we were just all over the sky, back to back to back to back. So you're working all of your systems all the time. You never know the geometry. Now, they never maneuvered against us, but sometimes they just maneuver for navigation. So it was great practice and a whole lot of fun.
Just in terms of setting up the scene then for when you do go to Desert Storm, and of course you eventually get your kill. What did you know about the Flogger at that time then? And as a second part of that question, were you aware of constant peg? So one of the things that you hear about when you talk to guys, especially the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron guys, the guys from the 33rd Tactical Fighter Wing at Eglin, Paco Geisler had got them all into constant peg a very short period of time. In fact, multiple times, I think, before they deployed to Desert Storm. And so they had been exposed to the MiGs that were out there in the desert in the US. Were you aware of that program? What was your understanding of the threat, and how did you come to that understanding? What were the pieces of the puzzle that you had around the Flogger and its capabilities, and similarly the MiG-21?
Yeah, I was not familiar with constant peg at all. I got to backing up a little bit, my time as a FAIP, there were no threats, or the threats were students. So there was no tactical thought or study into that. And I got to Soesterberg. In the first 6 months, it was just going through MQT and, becoming mission ready. And 6 months later, I was at Desert Storm. So there was not a whole lot of time involved there. For my mission qualification training, part of that is understanding the threat. So I spent a lot of time in the vault, reading the 3-1 series and learning what I could about the current array of bad guys, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, MiG-29s, Su-27s, and just studying those airplanes and what their capabilities were, what their maneuvering speeds were, what their tactics were assumed to be, what our tactics were going to initially be to counter them. At the time, though, from my perspective, it was all theoretical. I read an awful lot of stuff. I talked to other pilots. We didn't have any pilots with any combat experience. I don't know that there are any combat pilots active in the Air Force when Desert Storm kicked off, but certainly none that I knew or talked to. So it was just a lot of guys, wanting to do good and, cheerflying this stuff. How would you attack this? And we had training missions against high fast flyers and AWACS kind of airplanes and low altitude ingress. And, we'd set each other up or fly DACT, dissimilar combat training, with the bad guys simulating any of these planes. But sometimes I flew those roles, and I didn't really know how to be a MiG-21 pilot or a Foxbat. And so we'd give it our best so that we could train each other. But that's really all I knew about it.
Your aeroplanes at in the Netherlands, are they MSIP jets? You didn't have MSIP jets, did you?
Not at that time. We had the straight C and D models when I got there. That's what we took to war. We only took the C models. We had one D model. We left it at home. But when we came back, between then and when I left, we transitioned now to MSIP A's and B's.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together. Tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percentdrew.com, place an order. Thank you.
Can you tell us a bit then about you? I was going to say you hinted at it, but you didn't. You said it directly in the sense that you were somewhat disadvantaged in comparison to the Bitburg guys. Tell us a bit about the lead up to war then, and how you were sequenced as a squadron, how as a group, how you were sequenced into the war effort.
It was probably the darkest days, the only dark days of my time at Soesterberg. If I get the dates right here, I think it was August of 1990 when Saddam did his invasion thing. And then it was very soon thereafter, like within 2 weeks, our government decided to sell the Saudi government 24 F-15s. The F-15 line had been shut down for years, so we couldn't sell them new ones, so they had to take them out of the existing inventory. And the people making the decision, we've talked before about how they treated Soesterberg and Bitburg kind of as the same. They said, okay, we'll take half from each. So they took 12 from Bitburg. Bitburg had 3 full-up squadrons, and they took 12 from Soesterberg out of our 1 squadron. We had 24 airplanes assigned. I think we had 1 or 2 others that were maybe not on the books, but just there. So we were manned for 24 airplanes, and overnight we dropped from 24 to 12. Out of those 12, we still had that alert commitment that we were talking about, and that took a minimum of 4 airplanes. Sometimes there was the 5th one. So out of our 12, now we're down to 7 or 8. There's always a couple in maintenance because maintenance, phases it to get all 24 airplanes done. And that schedule didn't change just because we lost them. The airplanes we had left still had to go through maintenance. So now our 7 or 8 might be 4 to 6. And then there's generally a maintenance trainer somewhere, and there's probably one on the wash rack. So we had, on a good day, we might have had 4 airplanes we could fly, and we had 36 pilots. Wow. So our flying went into the toilet. So September, October, November, we were flying, I don't know, 3 or 4 times a month. So it got really bad for months. And we knew this whole Desert Shield was going on, and we weren't part of it. Towards the end of 1990, there was now talk that this might turn into a shooting war. And our squadron commander, bless his heart, he still went to the higher-ups and said, hey, we want to be part of it. This is what we trained for. We want to be part of any plans. And he was told bluntly and came back, and we had a pilots meeting. He told us that, look, these guys said your flying hasn't, you haven't met the ute rates to be qualified. We appreciate your interest, but no thank you. So everybody was pretty glum. We're a fighter squadron told that there's probably going to be a war and you can't play. That's tough to swallow because that's all you've been training for. I've been there a year. The other guys, much more senior than I, they've been there for several years with thousands of hours in the F-15, and we were told no. So life in the squadron was not good the end of 1990. Then I think it was late November, maybe early December, we got word that, okay, when this shooting starts, we're going to open up a second front that the Iraqis are going to have to deal with. Prior to that, all the war plans were the guys that were doing the Desert Shield stuff down south were going to take the war from the south into Iraq. And we decided, not me, the war planners, that no, we can open up a northern front. We'll put airplanes up in Incirlik, and now we're going to attack them from the north and the south. So Soesterberg was told, all right, we're going to take a couple of your airplanes and 10 of your pilots, and we're going to send them to the war if it happens. And that was right about the beginning of December. So at that point, the squadron commander, he picked 10 guys, and he said, okay, if the shooting starts, you guys are going. So they got 100% of the flying. I was not one of those 10. And the rest of us didn't fly at all. And again, morale is not too good unless you're one of those 10. But they got all of it. Then we had the Christmas vacation. And right before Christmas showed up, we got word that they've changed their mind. We don't need you anymore. Never mind. So the squadron commander encouraged everybody, okay, go home for Christmas. You haven't been flying. We're not going to fly. If there's a war, we don't get to play. Go do whatever it is you want. Get something out of your life right now. So we went away. We came back in early January as all the pilots are beginning to filter back in. And we didn't have 36 anymore because as soon as we sold the airplanes, they started trying to rotate pilots out of the squadron as quick as they could, but it takes a while. So we come back in early January. The boss calls us back together and he said, okay, looks like this is back on. This time he picked 12 pilots, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the 12. I don't know why. I don't question that logic, but I was happy to be one of the 12. So I got to fly some in the beginning of January, along with the other guys, to get our proficiency back up. And then we got the order to go. That in and of itself. So it was, I think, we were going to leave on the 16th. The day before the shooting was supposed to start. We were going to self-deploy to Incirlik. All of the available tankers were already in theater. We couldn't get ourselves there. We didn't have a tanker to get us there in one hop. So we were going to have to two hop. So we did. We took off we were supposed to take off with 6 airplanes on the 17th. The boss called us in the night before, said, okay, for the 12 of us that are going, go home and tell your families you're going to go on a trip tomorrow. You can't tell them where you're going. You can't tell them what you're going to be doing. You can't tell them when you're going to come back. Just go say goodbye. Come to work tomorrow morning at 6, and we're going to war. So we did that. That I will admit, that's one of the harder things I had to do, was say goodbye to my wife. And I had a young daughter. She was 2.5 or 3, knowing that, I was going into what was then going to be the mother of all battles. And I couldn't tell them where I was going, and I didn't know if I was going to come back. So saying goodbye was a challenge, but I did. And we sat around the squadron all day long. We could not get political approval to fly over France with live weapons. Even though they were saved, the French denied us entry. And because we didn't have a tanker, the route we were cleared to take had us going over French territory. So that evening, after waiting all day, the boss says, okay, go back home and we'll do this tomorrow morning. And that was even harder. Looking back, he should have just sent us to the queue. Pretend you've left. But no, we all go back home. Yeah, things have changed. We'll try again tomorrow. We know what's going on. They don't. But when we woke up the next day and turned on the TV, the war started that night. And it's all over the news. That's all that anybody can see. but we still can't tell them where we're going, what we're going to do. But it's now painfully obvious what we're doing. So it was much harder on the families that second day. But we go back to work. Because the shooting had started, France said, okay, you can fly over our country. So we came in, we loaded up, and off we went. And when we crossed into French airspace, French Mirages joined on us, and they escorted us until we got to the other French border, and then they peeled off, and we continued on our way.
Nice.
So that was our initial deployment to Incirlik.
Where did you stop then? So did you have to? Where did you stop before?
I think we stopped in Sigonella.
Okay.
We went through the hot pits. Never shut down the airplanes. We left with 6. That's all we could generate from back home. We didn't even have. We took the spares from Alert, and we took 6 to Sigonella. Went through the hot pits, and then once we took off again with the 4 primary airplanes, then the other 2 turned around and went back home. So we showed up with a 4-ship.
What is the expectation that you have then for what you're going to do when you arrive? So did you know when you were being told by your boss, go and say to your family you're off on a trip and so on and so forth, that was the day before the shooting war kicked off. Did you know that it was going to kick off on the 17th? And what are you expecting? You did not. So what are you expecting to be able to do with 4 aeroplanes from, let's call it the Northern Front, when you get to Incirlik in Turkey?
We knew we were not going to be the only Eagles there, because Bitburg was going to go down to Incirlik with us, and that we were going to be part of this new thing called a composite wing. So we were going to have 8 F-15s. We were going to have a handful of F-16s, some RF-4s, tankers that were already there, and B-52s that were going to support us, but they were going to stay based back, I think, in England. And we were going to be part of this new composite wing structure to open up a northern front. And as the F-15s, we were going there to be the OCA to protect them coming inbound, and the DCA to cover their 6 after they go drop their bombs. So we knew that what was going on. We knew we were carrying the only radar-guided missiles that were going to be on the northern front. There weren't any in Incirlik at the time, again, due to politics, as far as I understand it. There were plenty of bullets. There were plenty of AIM-9s. There weren't any AIM-7s, and the AMRAAM wasn't around yet. So the AIM-7s that we were carrying were going to be the only long-range radar-guided missiles in that northern front. So get them there and then go to work.
I might be taking you too literally, but presumably there would have been an aeroplane arriving with additional missiles fairly soon after you arrived. Yes, okay.
Yeah, but up until that decision was made, all of those weapons were being sent down south. There just wasn't anything stockpiled at Incirlik for a northern war. So the day we were going, we carried the only thing that was going to be there, and the logistics train was going to catch up to us, and it did. But to kick it off, you bring what you got, and you got what you bring, and that's it.
Wow. Okay, let me just go back a little bit then in time to this you're on, you're off, you're on, you're off type of situation that you guys were obviously put through. And the fact that you didn't know the war was going to kick off on the 17th, you actually fly out on that day. Had you been advised to, or had you taken advantage of the fact that you weren't flying to study the Iraqi Air Force? So Operation, I think Spear Tip is the name of the Air Force intelligence report. It's been declassified. It's available. It talks about the Iraqi Air Force in detail, talks about their training, talks about their capabilities. I'm pretty sure it's called Spear Tip. That's the name of the report that the Air Force was disseminating at the time to fighter units to give them the heads up on the Iraqi Air Force. Had you read that? Did you know much about the Iraqi Air Force? Were you kind of sitting there? I don't want to sound like you would have been unprofessional, but were you kind of disinterested because you didn't think you were going to be going? Were you interested nonetheless? How did you approach that period of time from a preparation point of view, even though you didn't think you were going to go?
Yeah, starting in September, where we were told you weren't going to go. Yeah, and I would suggest that maybe most of the pilots were disinterested. We were just told you're not good enough, and that's hard to swallow. So I was pretty disinterested up until I came back from Christmas break, and I was told I'm one of the ones that's going to go. Then I got real interested real quick, and I spent a lot of time in the vault reading anything I could get my hands on, as did the other guys.
What did you make of the Iraqi Air Force then? So I'm cognizant of the fact that you're new to the F-15, relatively new. You said you've been flying the airplane at Soesterberg for a year. So you're a wingman, and your experience is evident, or your inexperience is evident in that sense. But what did you make of the Iraqi Air Force on paper when you were going through that process of familiarizing yourself with them?
So first, let me correct you. So I had just upgraded to two-ship flight lead before they sold all our airplanes. So I was a brand new two-ship flight lead, not a wingman. We ended up with 12 pilots over there. There were 2 wingmen, 2 two-ship flight leads, and everybody else was 4-ship flight lead and or an instructor. So in reading about it, we knew they had a huge Air Force. We knew a lot about the MiG-21s and the MiG-23s and the MiG-25s, and we had practiced, fighting them with us or other NATO airplanes, simulating them, and, weren't too worried about that. But we also knew they had the MiG-29, and at that time, the MiG-29 was, bigger than life. That in the flanker, we assumed were our near-peer competitors, and we knew we had a bunch of them, and we were going to go up against them. And we also knew that Baghdad was the most heavily guarded place on the planet, and they had a pretty robust SAM defense and EOB. So we thought we were going to be facing a pretty stiff environment from some of their airplanes, but a lot of their SAMs, we never practiced SAM defenses. And then their electronics. We have a pretty good EW suite in the airplane, but it's really never been tested. So those were the concerns. Those were my concerns anyway. And it wasn't until we got over there and figured out pretty soon that this 10-foot tall King Kong MiG-29 was, all bark and no bite. But going in, you just, we all had to think about that. The whole mother of all wars kind of a deal. It's all propaganda, but that's when all you ever hear. And when you read the numbers of airplanes he has and the number of SAMs he has, it sounded like this was going to be a challenge. The classified reports, I don't remember what the numbers were, but they had, anticipated losses on our side, and they weren't pretty. It didn't say air supremacy. It was, a bigger number than you weren't going to come home, but we went anyway.
Can you describe then arriving in Turkey and what's the first 12, 24 hours like? So you got 12 guys, so presumably 6 other guys took a transport or something. You guys flew, the U-6 flew jets across, 2 of them turned back. What's the first 12, 24 hours in Turkey like?
So our arrival was not as we had envisioned it. So I'm going to tell a little story here. I won't mention any names. But so as we show up at Incirlik, the weather was not good. So we did a radar trail arrival, 2 miles between each of the F-15s. And the runway we were approaching, right at the end of the runway, is the boundary fence for the airfield. And outside was civilian world. And just to the right of the runway, I don't remember which one we were on that we were arriving at, there's a factory with a big parking lot. And that factory is where they at least bottled or maybe made Effie's beer. That's like one of the national beers of Turkey. So I just say that in prelude. So as we're in 2 Mile Trail, straight into this runway, one of our airplanes, when he gets near the final approach fix, he's in the soup and has to configure, puts the gear down. One of his AIM-9s fires. There's no target. The master arm, he swears it was not on, and I believe him. We're all very professional pilots. Don't know what happened, but this AIM-9, and he's pointed at the base where we're going to go land. The AIM-9 did not make it to the runway, but it landed just short in the parking lot of the beer factory and blew a big hole in their parking lot. And then the rest, we all come in and land okay, but that was not the way we wanted to arrive. And then it became chaos. Nobody had done this whole composite wing thing before. There were some war plans, but not a lot. So they had to get us all bedded down. They immediately put between us and the Bitburg guys, we were on alternating schedules, 10 days of day, 10 days of night, because it was going to be a 24/7 operation out of Incirlik. And then within your day or night, you're going to be on the schedule 2 days, have 1 day off, then 2 on and 1 off, was sort of going in plan. But nobody really knew that. We had been flying all day. Some guys were put on missions that night, so crew rest kind of went out the window. We had to set up an operations area. We had to figure out where the hazes were, when and where and how are we going to brief, where are we going to stay. It was very, very hectic for those first couple of days until we got into a routine. And then I thought it was a pretty good ops tempo after that. Just to, poke my Southern fighter pilots a little bit, we had been listening to this whole Desert Storm lead up for months. And we were well aware of the fact that these guys were flying long sorties in holding patterns, nothing going on, just endless droning. And then they'd go back and they'd land at their base and they'd sleep in a tent and eat in MREs. And General Order 1, there's no beer. And it just sounded like a crappy buildup, while we're back at Soesterberg with no flying. But other than that, life is pretty good. And then when we get to Incirlik, we're living in billeting, so there's no tent. I had a room with a heater and an air conditioner. I had a DSN phone, Autovon, whatever it is we call it these days. So, I could call home to talk to the family and update them on things. The O Club was open, so we had really good food with a fully stocked bar. We did this war right. None of the buildup, all of the advantages, and we still got to go fly combat missions. So it's pretty darn good.
Tell me about the first couple of days then. Are you getting a good feed from the guys in the southern portion, the southern front? So the guys from, the 58th TAC Fighter Squadron and, so the 1st Fighter Wing, didn't have as impressive a war as the Eglin guys. I think that's fair to say.
Right.
But are you from the Eglin guys? Are you getting some good intel as to what they're doing? Night 1 kills. You got Steve Tate. You've got JB Kalk. I think that's MiG-29, MiG-23. Is that coming through to you? Are you getting a picture of what they're experiencing in terms of the Iraqis putting up a bit of resistance, but not really coming into fight, and then in the days that follow, sort of retreating a little bit and not flying so much? How much of what is happening in the south is being relayed to you, and is that of any use to you?
We're getting some, but not a lot. During our mass briefs, any kills from the day before would be briefed, so we'd know a little bit about it. Who the shooter was, what the target was, in a little bit about the engagement, but that was generally within 12 to 20 hours after it happened. So it wasn't always accurate, but we would get a little of it. As far as I know, there was no direct communication between us as pilots and them as pilots, where we had the capability, but their comm suites where they were, I don't think were as good as ours. We got the intel feeds and they were briefed all the time, but that's about as much as we got from them. We knew what had happened and roughly where it happened and when, but we didn't get the details like when guys at Incirlik, shot somebody down or, had good bomb runs or bad bomb runs. That was really the value to the composite wing from my perspective. And again, I was a young guy at the time, certainly a young tactical guy. But to be able to brief with them, I didn't know a whole lot about, what a Viper could do, what kind of weapons he could carry, what his procedures were. The same thing with the F4s, RF4s. We had the Wild Weasels with us. I spent my time studying the bad guys, not the good guys. But to have them brief and talk about their weapons and their tactics, and then best of all, the mass debriefs were invaluable. Nobody had any combat experience. And we, as a group, made some dumb decisions. But because we were all in the same room, unlike what you're talking about with the guys down south, we were all in the same place. And we'd have guys stand up and talk about getting lit up by SAMs. What did it look like? What did it feel like? How did the airplane react? What did they do to survive it? And we would, sort of jokingly have this period where, guys would have to stay up and say, yeah, I'm an alcoholic. Not being an alcoholic, but certainly do this confessional thing and say, okay, here's something that I screwed up and it could have turned out a lot worse, but let me tell you what I did, why I did it, and why you shouldn't do it again. And it was coming from the air-to-air community. It was coming from the air-ground community. It was coming from the recce guys, from the electronic guys. And that made the learning curve exceedingly steep. And in my opinion, really, really made a case for this whole composite wing stuff. I mean, that was phenomenal. It allowed us to take a bunch of highly motivated, pretty well-trained fighter pilots across all of our weapon systems and allow them to become a really effective fighter force with no prior combat experience in a very short amount of time. It worked it was just wonderful. Worked really, really well.
So it sounds like a facetious question, and it's not. It's a genuine question. What were you doing? What was the Northern Front doing? So when you talked earlier, I think the way you phrased it was that once the war kicks off, we're going to give them a second front to deal with. So, I mean, logically, making your opponent have to fight two fronts sounds like a smart idea. So that makes sense. Was that the primary function of what you were doing out of Turkey, just to give the Iraqi something else to deal with? Or did you, and again, I'm not taking the mickey, it's a sincere question, did you have objectives in terms of taking, because there were no troops there, so you weren't supporting force on the ground, I don't think, or there weren't traditional, I mean, there might have been some special forces down there, but, were you there to achieve military objectives, or were you there simply to pile on the pressure and create a distraction?
Begin with, it was more along the pile on the pressure. The guys in the South could now concentrate their firepower, generally Baghdad and target south. And we generally concentrated our firepower north of Baghdad. We had a couple of missions that would go downtown, but we went a lot to, Kirkuk. I'd have to look it up. I can look it up for the next one, but we had other target areas, and it was pretty much supporting the strike package. I did write down somewhere, I'll have to look it up. Our strike packages were huge, in my opinion. The daytime attacks, we generally had about 50 airplanes airborne. In the nighttime, it was generally 35 or so. But it was pretty conventional in that it was the air-to-ground guys, the mud movers, or the strike package The F-15s, we would always take off second, actually. The first guy to take off was the tanker, a series of tankers. The F-15s would take off. We all were assigned tankers, but we'd be in the front group. And it was a 45-minute, 50-minute transit just to get, north of Iraqi airspace. We could not fly over Syria. So we'd go to Lake Van and we'd refuel there. We refueled 8 times maybe in that short amount of time just to keep our tanks always topped off because we never knew when we were going to need that gas. So we constantly cycled through the tanker. And then we would go in and set up caps around the target area for that mission to make sure the bad guys aren't going to disturb our strike package. They would come in behind us. They would do their attack. Occasionally there'd be a re-attack. We'd have communication for that. And then once the last guy was off the attack and heading back north, then we would sort of follow it from the rear, make sure they got back out of Iraqi airspace safely. And then sometimes we'd come right home. Sometimes more of those dumb decisions, we did some things that maybe weren't smart in hindsight, but nonetheless, we would cover their egress, then come home and land and do it again.
Can you elucidate on the things that weren't so smart?
So I can remember I started out on the daytime missions. I told you we had that day-night swap. We did do paired 4 ships, so I flew the same guys. I thought that was another good decision from the tactical part because you really got to know your 4 ship, and that was our basic working entity, how they thought, how they targeted, what their comm was going to be like. It just made it work so much better flying with the same guys all the time. But in those first few missions, after the strike package was gone, we would fly maybe a little lower. And instead of coming straight home, we'd fly up, like the Tigris River or something, and we'd try and jettison a fuel tank on something that looked like a target. There are no ballistics for that. They're always out of gas by then, but we were just fighter pilots fucking around. And we did it the first time I flew at night. And we came up the same river doing the same sort of clown act. However, now you can see tracers. And during the daytime, what looked like just a river through the desert, and we're just screwing around, there's hot lead coming our way that you couldn't see in the day, and it was really obvious at night. We never did that again. We were just lucky. I mean, it was dumb decisions made by inexperienced guys their first time in combat. So we learned, and we'd go home that night. We did that part of our debriefing. Hey, guys, first night mission. Let me tell you, in the daytime, where you don't see any bullets, there's a lot of them there.
So I think the most amazing thing about that is that you've got F-15 pilots trying to drop a bomb.
Don't ever say that to a bomb dropper. We weren't dropping bombs. We were just trying to add to the war effort.
Tell me, Muddy, a little bit about your first combat mission. Then was it, don't tell me about if it was anticlimactic. If you just went out and flew a sortie and came back and nothing happened. But those first 10 days, then I don't want to talk about the kill on this one. We'll talk about the kill next time. But those first 10 days, what missions stand out to you? And I'm really curious to just explore a tiny bit. You mentioned you had a wife and a 2.5, 3-year-old daughter at home. How do you approach going to combat, the possibility you won't come home? Do you just you just park that? Are you able to just put that in a box, close the lid for the duration, and then you don't open the lid again until you get back? That's two questions I've asked in one, but answer whichever ones you want.
But so I'll answer that second one first. That is the way that I did it. I think it's probably the way everybody did it. Nobody had combat experience, but we had all read about, the Vietnam War and the the problems with that leadership picking the targets, everybody going over there for 100 missions, and then you're going to go home. So everybody was just sort of ticking the time, and the leadership made it very clear that those two things in particular were not going to happen. We're leadership not going to get in the way of targeting. We hired you guys to be tactically smart. You do it. And two, you're there until the mission is done. Don't know how long that's going to be. Don't care, but you're there until it's over. So nobody was thinking about going home. Nobody was looking forward to a date to go home. It was just do your mission the best you can every single day until we win, period. So you would park the rest of that. Even though we had DSN phones, you could call home. I don't think people did that very often at all, because that was a whole different world. We're there to do a mission. I wrote a few letters. We got mail call, but I don't think there's a whole lot of reaching back. We were in it for the long haul to just get it done. The mission sets for those first 10 days, we had 3 different missions we were tasked with: OCA, DCA, and AVA protection. So offensive counter-air, where we didn't have a strike package, we just send the Eagles in, and we would just go wandering around looking for bad guys, trying to stir up trouble. Those were fun. There wasn't as much, there's hardly any coordination, because it was our 4-ship. We'd have 2 4-ships up there frequently. So we would divide the airspace. You take the east and the west, we'll take the west, or vice versa. And then we would devise our own tactics, and we were just out there, looking for trouble. Then we had the DCA missions. That's with those great big strike packages, where we'd go in first. The Wild Weasel guys were generally right behind us. The strike package was behind them. The RF4s were behind them. We would station our caps in between the known bad guy airfields and the targets of the day. And we always made sure we had radars on those airfields, Eagle radars, to be able to pick up anybody who was going to get airborne immediately. And we'd cover that until everybody's gone, and then we'd come home. And then we always had to have a defense. When we had AWACS, we had 2 versions of AWACS over there. We had US AWACS, and then we had NATO AWACS. Again, I don't want to disparage anybody, but the US AWACS was fantastic. They worked their dome. Their communications were timely and clear. And NATO AWACS was frequently worse than having nothing. Evolved to where if US AWACS canceled and they were scheduled for the mission, we would usually cancel that mission for the strike. And that might now turn into an OCA, and just Eagles, you go out there and play. When it was NATO AWACS and they didn't show up, we would re-roll a 2-ship of F-15s to go up and be EAGLEWACS. And just with 2 F-15s doing a counter-rotating cap, we were at least as effective per the strike package, not just the Eagle guys being assholes. Strike package saying you guys are better than NATO AWACS, with the air picture and the SA getting into their cockpits. So US AWACS was phenomenal. Next would be EAGLEWACS, and then NATO AWACS just sort of deal with them, because we couldn't tell them not to play, but we'd rather they not.
That's incredible.
Those were the mission sets we had.
Can you dive into that a little bit then? When I understand the concept of it being worse than having nothing, in the sense that if they give you bad information, I suppose that is what's worse than being nothing. But do you remember any examples of that? How did that render? Was it them telling you that there were some threats when there weren't, or they're not telling you when there were?
a lot of this would get debriefed, but we had multiple occasions in our 4-ship as well, even on, my favorite sortie, the NATO AWACS would call out a threat somewhere, and Eagles that had already sanitized that area now would have to go back and re-sanitize it, and there's nobody there. On more than one occasion, they would just call, a bandit and command, a break with no call sign. So you got 50 airplanes in the air, and somebody comes out on the common frequency, just says, "Ooh, and I mean, it was just ridiculous. And that kind of stuff is worse than nothing. I mean, you can't have 50 guys for the guys actually dropping the bombs. If they really have to do a defensive break, I think routinely they're supposed to jettison their weapons. That kind of makes it ridiculous, because if you say that and they really complied, now the entire mission is scrubbed, and we've got all these guys down there in amongst the bullets flying around, and nobody's armed anymore. So there were those kinds of things. Again, don't get me wrong; they're not the only guys that made a mistake. I told you what we would do up the Tigris River. We had guys roll in on targets only to find out that, well, they weren't airplanes; they were SAMs, and they were coming towards them. Just because of lack of experience. We had those kinds of things happen, and we live through it and we debrief it, and it doesn't happen again. But everybody was making mistakes. NATO AWACS just tended to make more.
So this is a nerdy question, but you mentioned EAGLEWACS, which is fantastic. I'd never heard of that before, but it makes sense. So the nerdy question is around capabilities then. So you didn't have the MSIP jets. The guys in the southern hemisphere that they rushed MSIP out to the Eglin units in particular. I don't know if I can't remember whether or not the Langley guys got the MSIP jets too, but you guys didn't have it. So, and I know that there are some parts of MSIP that are still not declassified, but the bits that are declassified are unclassified are around increased processing power, additional memory for the radar, that kind of stuff. I just wanted to ask the nerdy question, which is, were you in that sense disadvantaged in not having MSIP? So if you were doing something like the EAGLEWACS mission, would additional processing power, would additional memory, would any of those other things that came with MSIP have made a difference to you?
I think they could have made a difference in terms of the amount of SA we could gather if there was a target-rich environment. But given the threat we were facing, we concentrated our EAGLEWACS on the areas sort of surrounding it, because we would have F-15s in their caps out there that were protecting this specific target, and they knew the ingress route that the strikers were taking, so they were covering that area, but they didn't have the ability, just due to the numbers and the processing power of the radar, to build SA outside of their specific area. So be it AWACS, who would have the entire air picture, or EAGLEWACS, where we would concentrate our radar on those areas that we thought might be vulnerable, where the bad guys could come in and disrupt things. When the Eagles were concentrating on the strike package ingress and egress, and the strikers were concentrating just on their ordnance, we were covering those areas outside of that. But because we didn't have a target-rich environment, nobody did try and come up and interfere with things. If we had it, I don't think it would have made a difference, because we didn't have any targets to prosecute. If they had launched, 100 plane waves at us, it would have made a huge difference.
Okay. So with regards to where we are in the war, then I should have probably done some research before we started this call, or at least gone back and look at some of the things I've written before around the Iraqi Air Force and its behavior. So I mentioned earlier initially they put up some resistance, then they decided not to fly, and then at some point they decided to try and escape to Iran on the eastern border. Is that happening in the first 10 days, or does that come afterwards? What are you seeing? Are you starting to see guys try to sneak across the border?
We weren't seeing that airborne, but just a couple of days before my kill, it might have been, I think it was 2 days before, we started getting the reports that after we had egressed, the strikers all left, we cover their six and we leave, or on those OCA missions, we've been to the tanker multiple times and now we're going home RTB. Once we were inside Turkish airspace heading back, we would then hear that that's when the Iraqis were taking off their fighters and going into Iranian airspace. So they were still able to see us, but we were up high at that point. Nobody's trying to be sneaky. So that's when war planners initiated a 24/7 barrier cap between Iraq and Iran. It started, as I recall, roughly at midnight local time on midnight between the 27th and the 28th. And from the coordination between us and the guys down south were responsible from Baghdad. I forgot the 38th parallel, whatever the parallel was. They had from that line south, 30 something.
Yeah, okay.
But they had that south, and then we had from that area north, and there are now no longer strikers involved, but we were going to have a 4-ship of F-15s from the north. I can only address that. And we were tasked to patrol from Baghdad north to the Turkish border along the Iranian border, and just don't let anybody get through. And we started, like I said, on that midnight between 27th and 28th. The first 4-ship out there was a Bitburg 4-ship. And the general CONOPS, because we were there to cover 24/7, was they would be on station for about 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours. And then they'd go north of the border in the vicinity of Lake Van, hit the tanker, go back south another hour and a half or two, back to the tanker, a third vol period in their area, come back and hit the tanker and leave. And that's when the next 4-ship would come on. And we talked to each other. They'd tell us what we saw. We'd think, and we'd get gas and we'd go in. And that's what happened on the day that I was there. It was the very first day of this barrier cap. The Bitburg guys had done nominally from midnight to 6. It might have been 1 to 7 or 2 to 8, somewhere in there. And then we came to relieve them. And that was the story that, we got somebody. And it was like they had told us, we had been down there on our first period, and you're lit up occasionally by SAMs. Sometimes they'd shoot AAA at you, but it was all unguided, unaimed. And we had come back to hit the tanker, and that's when the bad guys took off trying to run to Iran. So we went and got in their way.
Okay. Well, I think that's a very good point at which to drop off.
Okay.
And make sure that the audience knows they need to come back for part 2 to hear the story of what happened on that day. So, Muddy, it's been fascinating talking to you. Appreciate you joining us. Really excited to talk to you again next time. And also, you've had an expansive career, obviously, beyond your exploits in Desert Storm as an F-15 pilot. So we'll look forward to hearing about that too. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you next, Steve.